Well, this is a class that's basically about modern Japanese history from the Meiji Restoration in 1868 until 1941 and the outbreak of war in Pearl Harbor. So we cover this long period of history. In the beginning, the first class, what I do is we ask the students, so how do people in the United States and Japan remember the war? In general, in Japan, they remember Hiroshima and Nagasaki. In the United States, they remember Pearl Harbor. And so what I ask is the students sit down, talk among themselves, what are the reasons why the Hiroshima and Nagasaki were bombed, and I ask them to talk about why Pearl Harbor was bombed. And so we sort of look at the beginning of the war and the end of the war. And then we, after finishing that segment of the class, what we do after that is we go back to the Bakumatsu period, the end of the Tokugawa period in the 1830s, 1840s, the prelude to the arrival of Commodore Perry and the Black Ships in 1853. We talk about the challenges facing the Tokugawa government at that point, and what were the reasons why things began to unravel, and what led to the Meiji Restoration. The emperor was returned to power, and then they embark on a very ambitious modernization program. What did they do? How did they do it? And what were the consequences? And so we look at the various modernization schemes, the economic modernization, development of military, the political and legal changes in Meiji Japan, and then we move forward to the 20th century and examine what were the consequences of those reforms, and particularly we focus on Japanese imperialism, the First Sino-Japanese War of 1895, then moving on to the Russo-Japanese War, and then as Japan gains a larger imperial foothold on the continent of Asia, how that leads it into conflict and competition with the Western imperial powers. Above all, Japan wants to revise the unequal treaties imposed on it, and it wants to achieve parity with the Western powers. Why, we ask, was Japan unable to achieve its aspirations within the existing international system? What were the reasons why Japan took such big gambles in the 1930s and began to operate outside that international system? Why did it become so alienated from a system dominated by the other Western powers, and why were those Western powers unwilling, unable to accommodate what Japan viewed as its legitimate aspirations, its legitimate needs? And so finally we come to what is generally referred to as the China problem. Why did Japan decide to solve the China problem by force? Why did it invade Manchuria in 1931? Why did it expand the war in 1937? And leading from the Marco Polo Bridge to the Nanjing Massacre and an expanding war in China. And how did this expanding war in China impact Japan's policies towards the region in terms particularly of Japan moving into Southeast Asia and then threatening the raw material supply lines of the Western powers? And so here we see the roots of conflict. I asked students to look at where did things change? Was it at the Treaty of Portsmouth when Japan gained Korea as a colony? Was it at the Versailles Treaty where Japan's request for a racial equality clause was ignored? Was it at 1931 in Mukden when the Japanese blew up their own train and then used that as a pretext to invade and take over Manchuria? What were the key turning points? These are some of the questions that we ask the class, and then students are asked in this class to do their own research, generally on some aspect of Japanese imperialism in the Asian region, and students will do reports on Japanese colonialism in Taiwan or Korea, Japanese occupation of some of the Southeast Asian nations, or they look at domestic issues in Japan. What was going on in Japan in the 1920s and the 1930s that led to the rise of nationalist governments who were embarking on imperial expansion overseas? Why did it seem better, from the Japanese perspective, to try to solve its problems and overcome its constraints by force of arms rather than working diplomatically and peacefully inside the international system. What were the various options? Why were some ignored? And why were some taken? And so hopefully by the end of the course, people in the class can understand the question we asked the very first day is, why was Pearl Harbor bombed? And so I think that this sort of brings the class full circle around to the first day's question, and they're able to understand the process of polarization, not only focusing on the events, but the long-term process and how certain choices and policies made over time led to certain consequences. And so for me, that's what's important about history, is connecting the dots, understanding how what is done before will then leave a legacy and conditions and shapes the options that face future leaders. And so that's how I want students to try to understand history in this course.